Radio Free Campus, brought to you by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni.
Welcome to Radio Free Campus. I'm Steve McGuire.
And I'm Justin Garrison, and in this episode, Steve and I talk about the hurt feelings of the American Anthropological Association. Why is their leader sad? Because the Vanderbilt Report we discussed in a recent episode had the audacity to say what several other people can see. Anthropology has some serious problems with politicized research. I'm personally glad that Claude Lévi-Strauss isn't here to see what's become of his beloved discipline. Quel dommage, indeed. Speaking of tone-deaf academics these days, we'll also discuss the stubborn ignorance of many professors and professional tools on X when it comes to debating and trying to counteract arguments in favor of intellectual diversity on campuses. And we will also chat about the University of Chicago Law School's move to ban laptops and other tech in classrooms for their first-year students. I wonder what Gemini thinks about that. Finally, we'll hand out this month's Apparatchik and Hero of the People awards, so let's get to it. Steve, sometimes you just can't make a joke about something because the actual event is already so ridiculous that there's really nowhere left to go in terms of, exaggerating for effect or something like this. And you and I both saw a story that was in the Chronicles of Higher Education. We talked at length in one of our recent episodes about this report that had come out that was commissioned by the chancellors of Vanderbilt and Washington University in St. Louis. They put together a panel of scholars from a variety of schools and a variety of disciplines, and they had a very kind of narrow, modest charge to look at the state of scholarly research in the humanities and humanities adjacent social sciences. And they came up with what, we discussed. I think our consensus as a team was, fairly middle of the road, reasonable critiques. It wasn't one of these, there's nothing to see here kind of arguments that you tend to get in higher ed. It definitely wasn't, some kind of extreme anti-university kind of conclusions that, it's a hopeless cause or whatever. I thought it was pretty nuanced. But there was a field that seemed to come into pretty serious criticism on its research. And this is the field of anthropology. And so shortly after this, the American Anthropological Association issued a statement denouncing this study. And then the president of the AAA, not AAA, because you would not want to buy insurance from this professional organization. The president, Carolyn Rouse, gave a pretty lengthy and illuminating interview with Chronicles of Higher Education about what she and her professional association and that discipline see as the many problems with this report that, the shorthand, as we know, is the Vanderbilt Report. So when I was reading this, almost every paragraph had some kind of, I can't believe this is being said, this doesn't make sense. Short of giving just like a live annotated script for the entire interview, Steve, what jumped out at you here as worth talking about?
Illuminating is a good word. And I've seen other people say similar things, but the responses to the Vanderbilt Report in some ways are even better than the Vanderbilt Report itself in terms of making the arguments that it was trying to make. But yeah, this was a quite remarkable interview. I've seen it making the rounds on social media, on X. Pretty much everybody is blown away by it. I didn't see too many people defending it either. And this is a professor at Princeton. She's, I think, just ended her time as chair of the department there. She's president of the top scholarly association, as you mentioned. So, this is a pretty important person. And the interview is just incredible. I think the part that stands out to me, it's almost difficult to pick, but I think the key, most important point probably at the end of the day is when the interviewer from the Chronicle, I believe it's Stephanie Lee, asks her about this panel that was canceled a few years ago at one of their meetings. And it was looking at biological sex. And I think arguing that biological sex in humans is binary. And she defends the cancellation of the panel. and says that this in no way is in contradiction with their claims and their responses to the Vanderbilt report that anthropology is open to critique and debate. So it just puts into stark relief that there are people within this field who somehow think that canceling panels is consistent with open discourse and free inquiry. And not only does she defend that, but she even goes on to say that it's evident that sex in humans is not binary and anyone could just Google that. Right. So, I mean, there's so many layers here of how problematic this response is. The interviewer points out that there was a survey of a certain segment of anthropologists, and it wasn't 50-50. I don't have the number pulled up right in front of me.
It was like 54-46. I mean,
it was close.
It's not a slam dunk in any, either direction
on this question of whether sex is binary. And so the interviewer points out, well, this doesn't seem to be settled science as far as anthropologists are concerned. And Rouse's response to that is basically, I don't believe in opinion research, which again is just incredible. So, I don't know where else to go from there. What else would you add? What would you point to that jumped out for you?
Well, just to stay on this point for a moment, this is really interesting. And so I've got this quote about this last point because I wasn't expecting much from the interviewer. Like, this is not a hostile interview. It's not as if the president of this association sat down with someone on Fox News or something who would probably really push very hard against a lot of these things. But there's clearly like a journalistic effort to just get some facts out there and to ask for answers to questions that are pretty straightforward. And on this one, the quote from Rouse was, "I just don't trust opinion polling." That's from just being an anthropologist and spending a lot of time with people in the field. People don't know a lot. I mean, that's pretty great. In a way, I mean, that's so dismissively beautiful. I mean, I almost wish I had that on a plaque. People don't know a lot. But there's a sense in which, of course, there are public opinion polls that show that people don't know stuff. We've done some recent polling at ACTA about civic knowledge, and it is gobsmacking sometimes what people don't know. But this was not a poll that was like one of those man on the street interviews that's kind of designed to make people look dumb. This was a study of professionals in the field. And, you can disagree with professionals. Not all people in any field think the same way. But the last thing I think I would call people in a field like that is like, they don't know a lot. I mean, I would say they probably do, in the sense of anthropology. Yeah. I think one of the things that's really helpful in this particular article, if someone's reading it, to understand how people who oppose viewpoint diversity, who don't want robust debate, who aren't champions of free speech. I mean, she's clearly not that on her own telling in this interview. I'm not, making that up or reading into something that isn't there. The thing about this is when it comes to the gender question that you were talking about, this panel, and, we've both been to plenty of academic conferences. Panels take up all kinds of topics. Not all panels have to be arriving at the same conclusions. That's kind of a sign of a really bad field of study if everyone comes up with the same answers. Hint, hint, anthropology. And even within a panel, you usually have people who are going to take different perspectives on the broad panel theme. But to give the impression that this is just not even up for debate, and to frame it the way that she did, this is a scientific fact, and we're pretending that it's somehow in dispute if we platform people who disagree. That's not a scientific statement. That's just propaganda. Mm-hmm. Unlike, say, the spherical nature of the Earth being a proven fact in the sense that you wouldn't need to platform flat earth theorists to be viewpoint diverse. This is very much a live issue. It's not settled at all in the field, as the survey that the journalist brought up draws attention to. And there's just a complete closure to any discussion of that issue. And not only is it like kind of the pseudo appeal to science, but at one point she makes this claim that somehow if you are, I guess, a proponent of the sex binary, this is the quote, "I don't know, maybe you want to kill babies that just aren't presenting XX or XY."
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
The whole thing, I guess, if there was like a theme that runs through the article, it's that it's an ad hominem attack. I mean, some of this stuff is just absolutely ludicrous. And it is the kind of thing that, because this is an interview, this is not like anything other than, I think, a really revealing account of how serious the problems are at a lot of universities, not just at Princeton and not just in this field. But, you know, these are the kinds of things that, were they part of the regular classroom discourse, if you disagree that gender and sex are both on a spectrum, I guess what that means is you want to kill babies, you're a Nazi, or, you know, whatever the other things are. I mean, if you taught like that, those are actually things that are actionable under professional conduct standards. You know, academic freedom is not the right to just do whatever you want. Academic freedom is a privilege that has a corresponding duty. And one of those is just basic professionalism. Now, I have no idea what her classroom is like. Maybe it's completely different from how this interview comes off. But if this were the classroom, it's incredibly unprofessional.
The other thing is that when she does talk about sex and chromosomes and that sort of thing in the interview, she also switches back and forth between sex and gender. So even in terms of her discussion of that issue on the merits, there's confusion in her thinking about it that is troubling. And so for someone who thinks she knows the truth about this, and you could just Google it, to be the person who's also saying other people can't have a panel discussing these issues, really highlights the, you know, one element of the problem here, you know, with sort of deciding when debates are foreclosed. And you see this tendency elsewhere to treat things as settled science or debunked, and people just want to shut down debate and have everybody officially accept their view of the matter. And yet, once people start talking about it, you realize actually there's lots of disagreement. There's lots of room for discussion. There's plenty of people out there who disagree with you. So it really is about power and control, rather than free inquiry and the pursuit of truth. And she's very dismissive as well to other people. At another point, you know, the interviewer is continuing to press her on this issue. You know, doesn't rigorous debate include things like this panel, I think is sort of the point she's trying to make. And she says, quote, rigorous debate with factual information, or rigorous debate with just people who like to troll people on social media. I think one of the people in the panel is big on right-wing social media. I don't know. I'm not on social media at all. It just seems like a big waste of time. I mean, whether the person's on social media or not shouldn't really matter at all.
No, and you know, that's a classic. That's like a professorial gem. I have a clear opinion about this, but I don't know anything about it. You know, I mean, there's that old joke, like, have you read this book? You know, the professor says, read it. I haven't even taught it yet. You know?
That's right. Yeah.
You know, professors can get into that. I probably know more about this than my undergrads, so you can become just kind of lazy and, you know, you just say things.
The other thing she says is that this panel shouldn't have passed peer review, right? That's how she tries to set it up, that really this is just a sort of stray incident that got into the public eye because whoever was responsible for the peer review process and selecting panels for the conference failed at that process. And that if there had been a proper peer review process, this wouldn't have seen the light of day. Well, we say all the time that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And another way of putting this argument is, it's just unfortunate that people actually got to see for once the inner workings of how their professional association operates when it selects panels for its annual meetings. There's just nothing on its face that makes this panel look unreasonable. Like you were saying, there's all kinds of panels, held at professional conferences for scholars. They cover all kinds of different topics. There's just no reason why a panel like this shouldn't be allowed to proceed. And her insistence that it was rightly canceled, even though they're open to debate and inquiry and dialogue in their field, and that really this is just an instance of something like flat earthers trying to work their way into the conference or something, is just so classic and so wrong-headed. I mean, we just see this over and over again. We're going to talk about viewpoint diversity in a few minutes. And again, same thing. Over and over and over, people just revert to these same points, these same arguments where it's like, no, it's not that I'm not open to freedom of inquiry. It's just that everything you think is wrong, and then often they shift things that are matters of scientific or philosophical debate, and they turn them into just sort of binary questions of fact. And there's no room for debate. There's no room for interpretation. There's no room for disagreement. You just have the basic facts wrong. And that's why your views are inadmissible. And they say that over and over and over again to people who dispute that characterization of their views entirely. And they just don't care, because in their view, they're right and you're wrong, and they have the power to shut you down. And that's what they're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it reminds me of the guy who runs the cowboy bar in the Blues Brothers, and he says, we like both kinds of music, country and Western.
That's right.
It's like, that's the acceptable range of discourse.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a real, so many, hidden gems. That's an active pun if you don't know, dear listener, in this interview. And in a way, if I wanted to be kind of snotty about it, which I definitely am, she makes like an inadvertent argument for viewpoint diversity, but only within this range, right? She says, rather than decolonization, the discipline ought to focus on establishing a continual decentering of hegemonic knowledge production. Yeah, stop doing decolonizing studies. That's the hegemon, right? Yeah. These narrow ideological methods of studying anthropological phenomenon, that's the hegemonic knowledge production right now. So, a very old book called Violence and the Sacred, which was like an international phenomenon in the early 70s, was written by René Girard, not a technically trained anthropologist, but a generally smart person who really invested time and care in that field to do some research that he thought was worthwhile. That would be a great kind of anthropological perspective to reintegrate into the discipline. But the problem is it can't be categorized efficiently in a very obvious ideological way. So perspectives like that just get thrown out the door. And so this kind of debate, as you were just describing it, it's only, it's like, the Maoists and the Trotskyites and the Marxists and the Reform Marxists and the Leninists, they all get together and have a debate. I mean, it's so diverse, right? But they're all buying into like a fundamental assumption about the world that's very narrow, and anything outside of it, which is quite a bit of stuff, is just excluded as the equivalent of, believing that drilling holes in people's heads releases the demons from their minds. I mean, it's such a sleazy way of trying to go through life as a scholar. It's very disappointing.
With these kinds of things too, it's often difficult to suss out how much of it is just that they're blind to the problems themselves versus are they aware that they're being dishonest. And when you read an interview like this, it seems, whether she's aware or intentionally, whatever she's intentionally doing, you read the interview and there's obvious blind spots. And then there's parts where you think to yourself, well, you're just not taking this seriously. This is not a serious attempt to grapple with these questions. And that, in a sense, is a kind of dishonesty, I suppose. And you see that all the time with critiques of higher ed, where people respond in ways that don't really take the critique seriously. And, either they think that the critique is just totally a misfire because they don't see the problems the way that the critics do, or they're just so invested in defending themselves that they're not going to take the critique seriously. And they're going to try to come up with responses that deflect and dissemble so as to avoid dealing with the real issue. But, I think the whole response that we've seen publicly from anthropologists so far, or most of the response, I actually have seen a few anthropologists like in replies on Twitter and that sort of thing. And, there are good anthropologists out there.
Sure.
They're just not in ascendancy in their field. But the sort of mainstream anthropology response, like I said at the beginning, has been more revealing than even the Vanderbilt report was in itself, and clearly demonstrates to anyone who has eyes to see that there are problems in the field. This includes their original statement. It includes some of the things that their flagship journal's been posting on social media. It includes this interview, right? All of these things point to a need for deep reform. And I hope that some anthropologists will see that and organize and try to do something about it. And I also hope that the institutions where anthropologists are housed will also think about things that they could do to sort of right the ship of anthropology, as it were. And if the faculty in charge of the department are not themselves willing to take a hard look at the criticisms and offer a coherent and thoughtful response and possibly propose some reforms that they could undertake in order to fix things, then boards of trustees or high-level administrators might need to pull some levers to try and get some change. And you know as well as I, as do our listeners, that there's this ongoing debate about whether academia will reform itself. And when you see an interview like this, you just want to give up all hope. Like, where, of internal reform, where are the internal reforms going to come from if this is the person who's currently leading the field? I mean, I'd love to see a statement or some kind of action from other anthropologists responding to this, maybe even as a group, saying this really doesn't represent the way that we do anthropology or think about it. We think there are problems with our field, et cetera, et cetera. It's probably difficult for them to do that because they operate in a discipline that is so politicized, which is one of the original points of the Vanderbilt report that the powers that be in anthropology are so eager to deny.
Yeah, and I think your comments are really, really important for people to really kind of not just listen to and move on, but to really think about. There have to be reasonable people in this field because there's reasonable people in all fields. The problem, in some sense, is there are not enough reasonable people in positions of leadership in departments, in different academic schools, or in this case, a professional association. So if you're an anthropologist and you do see some truth in what the Vanderbilt report is talking about, if you read this and didn't think, hooray for our side, but shook your head in disgust at such a ideological and mean-spirited attack on criticism, you have a choice. I mean, and I'm not making light of this. It's hard to be an academic when you take a stand. That can have real significant professional and personal costs in terms of friendships that suddenly stop, research funding that's denied, appointments to other positions within the university that are taken away. People who stand up for the right things in higher ed are often not rewarded until well after the events have happened or been forgotten. But your choice is to stand up and do something. And there are people within your discipline. There are people outside of higher ed who are on your side and want to help. At the risk of sounding like a Marxist, what do you have left to lose? You know?
Yeah. Well, should we move on to the latest dust up over viewpoint diversity?
Absolutely. So for those who don't know, Steve is quite active on X and social media, has giant following. If you don't follow Steve, you definitely should, because he breaks news and engages with news on X and does really great work there. So Steve, tell us a little bit about this debate that you've been following. And I use the word debate in, kind of scare quotes, because some of the responses to the thing that kicked this off are pretty weak sauce. Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think it started, I was kind of enjoying my weekend, the weekend that this blew up, and wasn't paying a ton of attention at first, but I think it started with Tyler Austin Harper doing a thread on X about viewpoint diversity in the academy. And, he's a former professor from Bates College who's now a full-time writer for The Atlantic. And, he's a man of the left by his own self-account. He's a Marxian thinker. He thinks that the problems with viewpoint diversity have, I think economic explanations at the end of the day. Lots of interesting thoughts, and but he does think that the lack of viewpoint diversity in the academy is real and that it's a problem and that people should do something about it, especially in light of cratering public confidence in higher ed. And so, he did a thread about it and just really got people fired up, people sort of pushing back on him. And, I think he kept going. He did a couple more short threads over the course of a few days. And then, Jeffrey Sachs, who's a professor up in Canada who does a lot of work on free expression, he did a thread on this as well, where he said, look, anti-conservative bias in the academy is real. And he went and presented some data and, a few other things, did a very long thread, very good, got shared around quite a bit. And then, there's just various other people commenting on this issue of viewpoint diversity. And, all of the classic responses came out, one way or another from various people. And, this is all a social media debate. So, some people say like social media is not real life and all that sort of thing. But, lots of debate about this and about what, if anything, academics should do about the lack of viewpoint diversity. But of course, the first question is whether there is a problem in the first place. And a lot of the responses just start right there. They just either deny that there's a lack of viewpoint diversity, or they deny that the skew is a problem, right? There's not even a sort of willingness to take on the idea that this is a problem that needs to be fixed. So it just kind of blew up. I've been participating in it a bit myself. And it's just, my main takeaway again is just, how unwilling some people are to even take the problem seriously, and how their responses to it just constantly repeat all of these responses that you commonly get when you bring up the problem. It's just like a repeating cycle, the same things over and over, and often, just not very informed or well thought out.
Do you want to go through a few of these? Sure. You can correct the record, not with the participants per se, but I mean, these are counter arguments that people in our audience are probably going to hear in conversations with people who do not want to do things that are viewpoint diverse friendly. So I noticed in some of the representative examples that you shared with me, and I won't name names, I don't want to get into that. But there's an argument that says, okay, so viewpoint diversity means hiring people who think the earth is flat, who reject evolution, who deny the Holocaust. You have to get every crank in the field in order to be viewpoint diverse. Surely we don't want that. So Why is that a bad argument? Why don't we have to hire Holocaust deniers and flat earthers, and we can still say it's viewpoint diversity?
Well, the first reason is that usually this response is just a rhetorical ploy to avoid addressing the question in the first place, right? You call for, sociology to add more people who don't automatically make the same assumptions about inequality that the majority of the discipline does, or something like that. Or you call for, maybe add some more sociologists who look at things like sociology of the family or sociology of religion. Like, these are the kinds of things you're talking about. Or you're, even in terms of politics, you're saying, it really would be better if there were more conservatives in the academy, or even more Republicans, right? And they will sort of immediately default to, well, what does this mean? Like hiring biologists who don't believe in evolution, or, they just think of the most outlandish, ridiculous positions. In a lot of cases, ones that are completely debunked within their fields. I mean, I'm not going to deny that we do get sometimes into issues where some people want to say the issue is settled or debunked, and there are others who say that it isn't, and that sort of thing. But I think the main reason is just, like I said, this is not really meant as a serious argument. It's a rhetorical trick to avoid having the argument in the first place. If you were more serious about wanting to address viewpoint diversity, you'd be willing to look at all of the different ways in which people are claiming there should be more perspectives, right? There should be this methodology here, or there should be people studying these questions there, or there should be people who think these kinds of things also participating in this debate. And you could look at all of those and say, yeah, in some cases, maybe in most of these cases, reasonable people would agree that even if I disagree with your position on this, or don't think it's the best methodology, I cannot definitively say that this has no place in the university.
Yeah, the science ones in particular, I find really frustrating, because it does seem just like a rhetorical tactic, because the assumption is obviously whatever the issue is, and this will usually come from someone in the social sciences or the humanities, that their preferred, conclusions are just as factually solid or scientifically demonstrable as evolution. So, and that's just right. Not the case. That's not true. There is a greater degree of certainty about things in the physical world, the biological world, than there is when we talk about, well, what would the criteria be for a thriving democracy? That's not an object that you study in a microscope, right? And I don't want to get into like a whole hermeneutical tangent, but even the science thing isn't nearly as disinterested and objective as people want to,
I mean, Aristotle basically makes this exact point, right? So this is an old insight, but you don't expect mathematical certainty in the fields of ethics and politics. And in mathematics, you wouldn't be satisfied with a kind of prudential reasoning.
Yes. Despite me repeatedly telling my children, when you're doing your plus and minus math, which is a super sophisticated way of putting that, by the way. If 2 + 2 is 5 or 6, it's not close enough. There's just an answer here. It's 4 in this case, and you have to get that. Yeah. I mean, that's a really important point. Yeah. Different fields of study, different lines of intellectual inquiry yield different kinds of results. And to deny that is either an admission of embarrassing ignorance.
Yeah, I mean, in politics, if you're like, okay, this is our best guess, let's just go do it, see what happens. That's not totally unreasonable. If you're building a bridge, you're like, okay, close enough, let's start building.
Oh man. Yeah. Unfortunately, when it comes to like home construction, we've got more in that.
I guess
like it's pretty solid.
Yeah. No, I guess when you think about it, carpenters, plumbers, they are kind of problem solvers as well in their own ways. So.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. So here's another common objection to viewpoint diversity. And be curious to hear if you think it's wrong, and if so, why. Conservatives are stupid, and oftenly obnoxiously stupid. So they can't cut it, and who the heck wants to hang out with those losers anyways?
Yeah, I mean, even whoever runs the Twitter account for the AAUP has made a similar point in the past year. I think we talked about that at one point on the show. This is one of the most common responses some variation of this, that conservatives are just too dumb to be in the academy, or they're not interested in critical inquiry, or all their ideas are bad. Again, just a totally unserious response. I mean, you could do, and people do research on things like IQ and politics or political ideology and that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of things that could be legitimately investigated in an academic way related to this. You could talk about, instead of say IQ, you could talk about psychological disposition. Are people who are generally Republican voters or who self-identify as conservative, do they have different psychological dispositions than people who identify as liberal? I mean, you could have these conversations and conduct these inquiries, and it can be interesting. But the idea that the goal is to avoid dealing with the issue and to just say, oh no, the reason that there's so few conservatives in the academy has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with discrimination. It has nothing to do with the culture of the academy. It's just that, conservatives are really not up to the task, which is just, setting aside what I was saying a moment ago about investigating all these things. There's clearly more than enough intelligent conservatives in the world that if they wanted to, they could function quite well in the academy. There are, of course, conservatives in the academy right now. And when we call for more of them, that's because there are more out there who could do this. Why they're not in there, part of the issue could be self-selection. And again, that could be because they have different interests or different inclinations. It could also be because they look at the academy and how hostile it would be to them and decide that they just don't want to deal with that.
Yeah. It's a serious question when you get into higher ed and you're not in, kind of the progressive mainstream with other professors. The tenure process is very stressful. Even when things are going well, you're not guaranteed anything. You could spend 6 years at a school and find out you got nothing. Mm-hmm. That's a very hard thing to do while knowing that you're kind of in an intellectual minority. It leads to a lot of self-censorship because the costs are quite severe. And, most academics are smart enough to never say those kinds of things out loud. There are exceptions, like when the dean of the Berkeley Law School, Erwin Chemerinsky, was surreptitiously recorded and said, "If I'm ever deposed, I will deny having said this," which is like a fancy way of saying I will commit perjury, which is not cool coming from the dean of a school of law. But I digress. Mm-hmm. And his argument was, or the point that he was making in this context was California, had banned affirmative action in the 90s. And so the University of California system had come up with ways that might have, I'm not saying did, just be very careful about how I'm phrasing this, enabled people to kind of work around that without technically violating things. And he said he would told his faculty, you can't talk about these characteristics out loud. You might think about them, you might vote with them in mind, but our debates about who to hire are not privileged conversations. So be very careful about what you say out loud. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing often works when it comes to conservative professors coming up for tenure or for promotion from associate to full or whatever. If you're outspoken, even if you do it in a kind of winsome, civil way, like the interview that you did in a different episode with Harvey Mansfield. He's not an ideological bomb thrower or some sort of, foaming at the mouth MAGA stereotype. He's a very, he's a gentleman, right? Mm-hmm. That still costs you something, even if the words aren't said out loud. So there's just such a profound dishonesty at work in so many of these replies and in how things actually work in higher ed. It's really sad to see how widespread those perceptions are, because it has real implications for what students are getting in the classroom and what the country is getting from those who go into that field or go through it to do other, kind of professional things after graduation.
Yeah. Well, it's just remarkable too to say, to essentially suggest that the problem is not discrimination against, say, conservatives, while you're saying that conservatives as a group are too dumb to be in the academy, right? It's like, again, like these responses just reveal over and over again the nature of the problem, even as they're trying to argue against it. It's not unlike the responses from Anthropology to the Vanderbilt Report. The responses to the criticisms about the lack of viewpoint diversity themselves often highlight the problems that the critics are pointing to.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the last things that I've seen this, we talked several episodes ago with John Tomasi about a book that he co-edited on viewpoint diversity in higher ed and in other areas of public life as well. And one of the things that his chapter in that book pushed back against is a way of thinking about viewpoint diversity that means like, well, the composition of the faculty should more or less track the ideological demography of the broader population. So if, the US is like 55-45 liberal to conservative, you should have that ratio. Mm-hmm. Now, I saw that come up in some of the tweets that you had said, if someone tweeted something like, if you have all of these far right, that was the language that was used. Those are not my words because I think that's a completely vacuous concept. If you have these far right media, organizations and corporations, and they skew that way, why can't the universities just offer an ideological alternative? So why is that a bad idea, Steve?
Well, first of all, the idea that the American media increasingly skews to the far right is laughable, but. There's been a few instances where perhaps you could say that it's moved a little bit to the right, from where it was. But yeah, well, first of all, you're basically suggesting that various institutions should be almost treated as ideological or political base camps for one side or the other, which I think is questionable in the first place. But then also specifically in terms of the university, I think it undermines the nature of that institution in itself as a place that should be characterized by the free exchange of ideas, open inquiry. And when you're talking about moral and political questions, especially, that has some representation of a variety of different viewpoints, perspectives, arguments, methodologies, all of that sort of thing. So I think it's damaging to the institution's ability to function. You get groupthink, questions are not asked, questions are prohibited, research is not honed by being scrutinized or criticized by people who see things differently. I mean, this is all part of the process that should be in place at a university. It's also just bad for the universities from a prudential or political standpoint. I mean, part of my response to this particular post was that we're seeing right now why it's bad for universities to be regarded as, like I said, a base camp for one side in our political system. If you look at the data on confidence in higher ed, it's just completely cratered among Republicans. And when you hear what people in universities generally have to say about Republicans, it's not very favorable. So Republicans arguably fairly regard the universities as their political enemies. And I think for a lot of people in the universities, they regard Republicans as their political enemies. And that doesn't seem, again, particularly healthy for the institutions themselves, but it also seems to raise the prospect of the kind of political conflict that we're seeing right now. And, I think a lot of the government action against universities, or against is a strong word. What I want to say is that some of it is political and motivated by politics, and some of it is motivated by a desire to genuinely reform higher ed. It's a mix of those two things, at least. And there are legitimate criticisms of these universities, and there are reform organizations like ours that have been calling on them to reform and trying to reform them for a long time. But, I think obviously there's excesses right now in terms of how political actors are going after universities. And that's in part a product of the universities allowing themselves to be set up as, being seen as just on one side of the political spectrum, which, to a large extent they are. So, those would be the first two things that I would say is it's bad for the institutions themselves in terms of their research and teaching functions. And it's also very politically imprudent for them as institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. We were talking a moment ago about Aristotle distinguishing between different kinds of fields of study, different lines of inquiry, and how they yield different results. Universities aren't media empires, and they're not private corporations in the sense that was being discussed here. There are private universities, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If Fox or what is it called this week, MS Now or
right, yeah,
whatever, you know what you're getting. Right? If you want a kind of a right or a left spin on whatever's happening, you use your freedom to choose which one you want to watch, because they are upfront about what they're doing. But a university isn't just like a different opportunity to do some kind of indoctrination. It's a fundamentally different enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And that tweet is further undermined by the fact that if you teach at a public university, you have a very different relationship to the citizens of your state and to your state government than if you are a private university. Some private universities really do market themselves in ways that are like, hey, we're conservative, or hey, we're progressive. And they can find students that are interested in going to a school that thinks of itself in those terms. Public universities should absolutely not be doing that.
Yeah.
I think that's a betrayal of the public trust.
Yeah. And, even the conversation around private universities has changed somewhat because people have realized, how much funding in various ways they get from the federal government. And people would like to see these institutions serving the country in more productive ways in some cases. Of course, you can point to the scientific discoveries, the technological innovations, all this fantastic stuff that universities are responsible for. But then when people look at things like the lack of civic education, and again, I'll plug ACTA's recent broadside to the nation calling on universities to require students to study American history and government. And then when they do require the study of these things, they should do it in a way that's attentive to key moments in our history, key documents, our political system, the Constitution, all these sorts of things, rather than focusing on niche issues or the research interests of the professor teaching the class. But when you look at, again, we've talked about this before, but when you look at the Gallup data and they ask people why they don't have confidence in higher ed, right? Cost is a factor. Faculty probably can't do too much about that, but political agendas or political bias is another one. Faculty certainly have a role to play there. And the other one is that people feel like the education doesn't adequately prepare people for the workforce. And, we could have a whole principled argument about the nature of education and liberal education, all that sort of thing in response to that one. But part of the response, certainly from faculty, could be, okay, well, let's look at this. What kinds of things do they have in mind? Is there anything that we could do? But instead, you get a bunch of people responding to someone like Tyler Austin Harper saying, there's not a problem here, or this isn't on us. It's just part of a right-wing assault.
Fascist propaganda, as one of the commenters said. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, and of course, there are people, in the media who are, exposing the excesses of higher ed, but again, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And, the question is not, making those people stop doing what they're doing, but how can you respond to it more effectively, or what other things can you do? And, on the representation issue that you brought up, I didn't address that a moment ago, but the, people keep saying like, oh, so what do you want? 50-50 or 30-30-30 or whatever it is. It's like, no, but again, that's kind of a red herring response or, a rhetorical ploy to avoid the conversation, because you're starting in a lot of these fields from such a low number of various, perspectives being represented that, just having a little bit more would be a massive improvement. And I think also with the public confidence data, right, it's not necessarily about 100% fix sometimes either. It's, first of all, part of it is PR, but there's also a need for substantive reforms. And you also want to manage things so that, okay, there's always going to be critics of what's going on at the universities, whether it's coming from the right or the left. But how can we manage ourselves in such a way that it doesn't get to the point where it is now, where you have this just overwhelming turn in public opinion against higher ed as a sector, right? And you have basically enough political momentum and political support for some of the excesses that are taking place right now. And the answer there is, like I said, some PR, but also make some reforms. Just willingly embrace institutional neutrality, willingly look at the question of viewpoint diversity and ask yourself, is there anything that we could do to make things a little bit better? Could we be a little bit more responsive to some of our critics, even if we don't totally agree with their criticisms, right? Let's just add a few people to the mix who bring some of these different perspectives that they want to see. Of course, in our view, this would have a salutary effect on the institution, but at the very least, from their view, they could point to, well, we've got this guy, and he's out here saying these crazy things that you think all the time. So what's your complaint, really?
No, it's a lot more complicated than what I'm about to say, but, I've often had this thought in my off work hours. If I were, a college president and I could just engineer, let's say I'm a left-wing college president and I have a lot of left-wing faculty. If you could just engineer a scheme that was basically 1 out of every 6 hires is a quote unquote conservative intellectual, you're not going to lose your institutional power. And then you've done something, right? You send people from that 18 to 20% to the state house to give testimony on how great things are or whatever. Yeah. I mean, even if it were that cynical in terms of motivation, it would still have a benefit. And it's astonishing to me that more leaders would rather be the captain of the Titanic than someone who could have, avoided the iceberg with plenty of time. Mm-hmm. I just don't get it.
Yeah.
Something I do get is a recent policy change at the University of Chicago in their law school. So I thought we could talk about that in a slightly more uplifting, kind of end of the major portion of this episode. Mm-hmm. The short version of this, as sometimes people have talked about this as the law school has banned AI. That is not true. What the law school has done is removed most instances of student technology in the first year. Mm-hmm. So you can't bring a laptop. It doesn't matter if you want to ask Claude or not. The laptop is out. And they have some pretty solid pedagogical reasons for wanting to do that. They are training people how to use AI in legal research in different contexts. So it's not what would you call it? It's not part of the wave of people who want to burn data centers to the ground. It's not that kind of reactionary move. It's a prudent move. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I wish more people would take seriously is there is one of the things we saw in the Anthropology interview was your citations are selective. Which always makes me wonder, how many citations would it take for you to say I'm right? Mm-hmm. There's never an answer to that question, of course. But there is a growing body of literature in this particular area. There's a clear cognitive benefit to students when they don't use computers in the classroom. Mm. Having to listen to a professor say something and quickly figure out, what's the most important part of that run of words? And then I need to handwrite it in a notebook. That improves deeper thinking and retention. It's a real significant improvement over, someone who just uses slides and you transcribe the slide, or you have a dictation device open, recording the lecture or something like that. So, to me, I wish more schools would move to this, not because I'm opposed to laptops or something, but just the evidence is growing that it's not helping anyone learn stuff.
Yeah, I think we all know you're opposed to laptops too, though.
That's well, but this is an official show, so come back to Radio Free Campus After Dark, and I'll give you my real thoughts on technology or something like this. But pretend that I'm a normal, reasonable person.
ACTA is not officially opposed to laptops.
That's right. To be fair, right? I'm recording this. We're recording this on laptops, and I love Michael Dell and everything that he stands for.
Well, this announcement too comes on the heels of a previous statement that was released by the president of the University of Chicago on sort of how they're going to approach AI, and announcing that they were providing AI to everybody on campus. And that, of course, raised a big response. I would say almost an outcry from some people. The line that I found most interesting in that previous announcement was where he said something to the effect that they were going to teach their students how to think with machines, how to think without machines, and how to think about machines. And given that AI is now a part of our world, I thought that was a pretty healthy approach as a sort of general way of outlining it. Of course, my concern at the time was, well, you've released this statement that you're providing AI to everybody and you're going ahead with that, but I haven't seen anything from the University of Chicago yet outlining in detail how you're going to, say, preserve liberal education within this framework. And it would have been nice to see that either first or at the same time. But then not too shortly after, we get this announcement from the University of Chicago Law School, and it's clearly the product of a committee that's been working on this issue for a while. And the first thing that I would say is just at the sort of 10,000 feet level that I loved about it is that they did something. They had a thoughtful policy where they're trying to do something about the impact that AI is having on higher ed and the world beyond, including obviously the legal profession. What we've seen from a lot of universities is either basically complete inaction or foot dragging, or embracing and signing deals with AI companies without really thinking through in any way how that is going to affect, they're just sort of becoming like AI boosters and just, oh yeah, we're going to give everyone AI. It's going to be amazing. We're going to be on the cutting edge. It's going to be fantastic. Yeah. And not thinking about things like what you were bringing up in terms of some of the evidence that's emerging that AI seems to, undercut people's ability to engage in things like critical thinking, which is, one of the skill claims that humanists and social scientists and universities in general kind of hang their hat on when they're trying to, make an argument to justify their existence or, people coming to study with them and that sort of thing. So I whether this fully works out in detail at the end of the day, maybe there'll be room for modifications down the road. I think that they themselves recognize that and are open to that, but they're trying something, and what they're trying seems very plausible. They're going to double down on Socratic education in the classroom for first-year law students. They're going to get all the technology out of there, and they're going to make people sort of interact with one another, debate one another, think for themselves or think in communion, with one another. And I think that's going to be really good for their students. On the flip side, they're not just banning AI, right? Back to that original Chicago statement, they are going to also teach them how to ethically use AI, right? Students are surely going to learn how to use it efficaciously as well. And I think at the end of the day, given that, like I said, AI is here, I think that's the responsible course of action for a law school and probably most university programs in general, which is that you still need to educate your students in a more traditional way while also preparing them to operate in a world where they have the advantages that AI brings, right? Rather than just uncritically embracing it or sticking your head in the sand and hoping that somehow this all works out. Because I think that AI is it's a profound challenge to the way that colleges and universities have been operating for some time now. I think what I usually say is that it's basically exacerbating and exposing problems that were already there to some degree. So for instance, problems with academic dishonesty, I think were already fairly more rampant than, much more rampant than a lot of people realize. And now the AI is making them more rampant and making it more obvious how rampant it is. So, that's an example of what I mean. And it shows that there was already a problem that universities were not properly dealing with, right? You catch somebody plagiarizing, you're supposed to report it to the dean. In reality, the dean generally doesn't actually want to hear about it. It's a lot of work to deal with, right? A lot of faculty, especially contingent faculty, don't want to deal with it because they're just causing headaches for everybody. And it sort of, puts a target on their back to some degree, right? Because it's like, oh, here comes so-and-so again. For some reason, this guy's in my office at the end of every semester with a bunch of academic dishonesty cases that take up all my time. Our administrators are like, look, we need these kids to be enrolled in this university. We need the tuition. Or your chair is like, look, we need these kids to be majors. All these different pressures. Yeah. But yeah, not to go on at even greater length, but, I think it's a real problem. I think it's also a real opportunity. And I think that the University of Chicago Law School is approaching it in a way that could plausibly address both sides of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just refreshing to see anyone in higher ed thinking prudently. There are people who do it. I'm not suggesting there aren't, but it's not like a common feature. And the one that really scares me the most in that kind of spectrum, there's a lot of Aristotle stuff going on today, which is always good, right? There's the kind of the Chicago is the mean between the extremes. And the one that really scares me is the boosterism, because I think there are plenty of schools, particularly like smaller liberal arts colleges, who are thinking about AI almost like alchemically. Like if we just do something with it, our retention problems, our enrollment problems, all of that's going to go away because we've embraced this thing. And it's, maybe, but maybe not. And you should really think through, what are you adopting? What are the limits? What are the possibilities? You can't just kind of make policy based on something you heard on NPR while you were driving in that was saying AI is the wave of the future. It could be the wave of the future off a cliff into a never descending, spiral of death. In this sense, this should always be the approach, whatever the policy is. You should think about your mission. You should think about what really matters to your institution. And then you should do things that align with that rather than just kind of a kitchen sink approach of whatever the latest fad is in tech or higher ed or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think colleges, universities need to think very carefully about sort of what their value add is and how they maintain that in an age of AI. And just going full booster without thinking about how this undermines the educational programs that you're offering in terms of their real substance, I think is a bad choice.
Yes. One that will inevitably be made by numerous university presidents who will not be there holding the bag when everything falls apart.
True.
On that note, let's go ahead and get to our awards. So this month, I am doing the Hero of the People. And our hero this month is Jeffrey Collins, an Associate Director of Academic Affairs at the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. We've talked about the Hamilton School before. We like what they do. And Jeffrey Collins was quoted in a recent article in the College Fix by Ethan Savka. And the article's titled, "Critics Label Left-Wing Plot to Target New Civics Schools as Misguided and Alarmist." So we had talked about this in an interview that we did with Lee Strang, who is the director of the Chase Center at Ohio State. We had talked in kind of the aftermath after we were done speaking with him about this concerted effort from the AAUP to try and harass and in other ways obstruct the missions of these centers, because from their perspective, it's all part of the great MAGA fascist conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. one of the things I liked about this interview when they quoted Jeffrey Collins is he didn't take the bait and kind of give back to the AAUP what it deserves, but, unlike me, was very professional. And he says, in response to this story about the AAUP and the Mellon Foundation trying to work together on this issue, these are quotes that the College Fix got via email. The Hamilton School was founded on the conviction that higher education benefits from intellectual diversity, rigorous inquiry, and civil discourse. And then he continues, rather than focusing on perceived threats, we are focused on creating an environment where students encounter a wide range of perspectives and learn to evaluate arguments on their merits. Now, I guess I'm nuts because when I hear that, I think, well, that's what obviously everyone should just be doing. But not the AAUP, right? Intellectual diversity, rigorous inquiry, civil discourse. These are all obstructions on the way to a glorious social justice future, as the AAUP describes their own values. So anyways, that's why I picked him as our month's hero of the people.
Yeah, great choice. Love to see what the Hamilton Center and all these other centers are doing to improve higher ed. So full support from us for sure. All right, well, let's get to the Apparatchik of the month, which falls to me. Well, I couldn't help but pick Carolyn Rouse. I know we've already talked about this at length in this episode, so I won't add too much more, although there are things in the interview, which of course we highly recommend, that we didn't even get to. Like for instance, and again, we brush up against having to use the F word on this show, but she apparently gave a talk at one point called something like F free speech. I think she was attacking the idea of a sort of absolutist principle of free speech in the academy or something to that effect. And certainly there are, reasonable arguments that could be made about, the difference between academic freedom and free speech and what kinds of speech you might want to have on a university campus. But, after what we've learned about her and her views, I'm certainly inclined to think that I would not agree with the argument that she was making in this talk, most likely. But yeah, we kind of had to pick the head of the American Anthropological Association doing this terrible interview that basically I've seen almost nobody defend it. I even went over and checked on Blue Sky at one point to see if I could find any defenders.
The Mos Eisley of social media, true hive just like scum and villainy.
It's like the message went out, okay, radio silence on this one, guys. But clearly academic departments and academic fields need leaders who are more open to things like viewpoint diversity, intellectual diversity, free inquiry, and that sort of thing than certainly what we saw in this interview. And so for that reason, we've selected her as the Apparatchik of the month.
Yeah, can't think of a more appropriate choice.
All right. Well, I think that's the end of our episode for this month. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to see the interview with Harvey Mansfield by now. Really great interview. Really, again, enjoyed it and was honored to have the opportunity to take a little over an hour of his time to talk to him about his thoughts on where Harvard went wrong. And this has also been a pretty enjoyable episode, although, the events that we've had to discuss are unfortunate for higher education.
Yes. If anyone's disappointed with the tone, don't blame us. Blame higher ed. If we had better stories, we would definitely talk about them. But until the rot is cleaned out, this is what we're dealing with. We're in the muck. We want to get out of it. You can help us get there. So until next time, thank you for listening. Like our show, subscribe, share it with your friends. KBO.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Free Campus. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. Audio-only versions of Radio Free Campus are available on all other podcast streaming platforms. Whether you have comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, the hosts would love to hear from you. Comment below or email them at radiofreecampus@goacta.org. Radio Free Campus is offered by the Campus Freedom Initiative at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. For more information, please visit goacta.org.
58% of Virginia Commonwealth University students surveyed say they would feel uncomfortable being close friends with someone who holds different views on gender, race, or social justice issues. Discover more at goacta.org.